Hi everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you just found this place, then welcome. I'm Alex, and this is my channel where we theory craft and explore different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Today we are continuing the Gloomhaven series of character builds, where we're trying to take the character classes from the hit board game Gloomhaven and recreate them in Dungeons & Dragons. For those who know Gloomhaven, we're going to be recreating each character class from Gloomhaven, the Forgotten Circles expansion, Jaws of the Lion, and Frosthaven. For any of the locked character classes, I'll be sure to add plenty of spoiler tags so that nothing is given away about any of the classes that aren't already considered public knowledge. Additionally, I'm not recreating each of the character classes' cards individually, but rather looking at their main mechanics, character art, and overall theme for inspiration when trying to recreate the character using D&D mechanics. For those who know D&D, I will be using a bit of Unearthed Arcana since these builds are mainly just for theory crafting and fun. Unearthed Arcana is unofficial material, so it may or may not be okay depending on the DM. And if you'd actually like to use these builds in your game, then I'll be sure to add suggestions as replacements when needed to get around the unofficial material. Today we are making the Spellweaver in D&D. Overall, the Spellweaver is an AoE specialist. They have a lot of lost cards with very powerful effects, and they are also the first class of the starting six that uses the most elements. They have access to each and every single one. Others, like Cragheart or Mind Thief, will use some elements, but not nearly as much or as many different kinds of elements as the Spellweaver. We are going to want to take a spellcaster class to reflect the unique but powerful cards that the Spellweaver has, especially since the Spellweaver is kind of like that spellcasting archetype of the first 6 Gloomhaven character classes. The other unique feature that the Spellweaver has is the refresh card. They have the smallest hand size of all the Gloomhaven character classes, but the way they make up for that is through the card Reviving Aether. Reviving Aether allows them to get back all of their lost cards, which most other Gloomhaven classes can't really do. This allows them to either lengthen their longevity by just playing more cards safely for a longer period of time, or they can get back their really powerful loss effects to be able to do those cards over and over again. Similar to powerful spell slots being expended in D&D and then being able to refresh those and use those powerful spell slots again. This is going to be something that we'll want to try to emulate as much as possible, since it is really what sets the Spellweaver apart from other character classes in Gloomhaven and especially other spellcasting classes. Before we start the build, let's look at their flavor text. The Orchid Spellweaver. The Orchids are an ancient meditative race from somewhere across the Misty Sea. They view the happenings of the world through the detached perspective that their 1,000-year lifetimes allow. For the Orchids, life is about spending the proper amount of time on thought and reflection so that the right decision can be made at the right time without hesitation. Orchids have been known to get lost in thought for years, and during this meditation, crystals will begin to slowly grow on their skins. Since orchids have little need for physical comforts and draw their sustenance from the earth, they serve little purpose in normal society. Many believe that the increased presence of orchids in Gloomhaven in recent years is evidence of an approaching catastrophe. Through deep meditation, some orchids arrive at the conclusion that proper action requires not only thought and discussion, but also force. There are many physical threats to the orchid society, and some are called to join the ancient order of spellweavers, orchid sages who are able to draw forth powerful natural forces and craft them into concentrated attacks. Some spellweavers choose to remain with their society to act as guards against outside threats, but others choose to travel the world, destroying these threats wherever they find them. Starting in character creation with our lineage, we're going to take custom lineage as usual. The Spellweaver is an orchid, and orchids don't exist in D&D, even though there are some similar races that could work. We're still going to make up the orchid ancestry anyways. For our custom lineage, we're going to take Dark Vision. I actually have no idea if orchids have Dark Vision or not, just like other ancestries from Gloomhaven. However, we're going to take it just for fun anyways, simply because we, again, don't need the extra skill right away. So it's probably the better of the two options. Now there are tons of options which we can pick for our feat, and I don't think there's any one specific option that works best, and I also don't think there's any one specific option that works worst. We're going to be a caster, which means I would recommend grabbing a feat that can synergize well with casting. Personally, I'm going to take Metamagic Adept. We don't really need to take an extra ASI right off the bat, though it won't hurt us if we do. Extra ASIs are always good. But here instead, I'm going to try and grab Metamagic. From that, I was just taking Twin Spell and Transmuted Spell as our first two options. Twin Spell will give us some AoE when we normally don't have any, by letting us effectively add a target to one of our single target spell attacks. Actually, it doesn't even have to be an attack, it just has to target one creature specifically. Transmuted Spell, on the other hand, is going to let us play around with spell damage types in order to A, bypass resistance, and B, better mimic the elements from Gloomhaven being used on various spells. You can take different metamagic options if you want to, but I would certainly recommend these, especially since they're actually both fairly powerful. For our stats, we're going to take the +2 from Custom Lineage and put it into Charisma and pretty much just call it a day. Using Point Buy, of course, we actually wind up with a really balanced stat line of 10 Strength, 14 Dexterity, 14 Constitution, 10 Intelligence, 10 Wisdom, and 16 Charisma. For our background, as usual, it doesn't matter too much what we choose, though based on the Gloomhaven class theme, Sage does sound like the most thematic option to me, so I'm going to be picking that. Starting with the level breakdown of the build now, for level 1, I'm actually going to take a quick minute to talk about what we're trying to accomplish here. I've looked closely at the best way to make this build, and there are multiple ways we could take it, especially since the Spellweaver itself is a fairly loosely defined canvas. They're the spellcaster of the starting 6 classes, they play with elements the most, and they have plenty of AoE damage cards. They have single target damage cards as well, but their AoE are the big powerful loss effects that we want to try to emulate. And if we're just looking to emulate those things specifically, then I would say Wizard or Sorcerer would probably be our best bet. However, the Spellweaver doesn't really have fully innate magic, nor do they technically learn their spells strictly through a spellbook and study. These aren't major things, but they are enough thematically to make me want to at least try to look at all options before settling. We know that they get their power through some form of training, as well as a bit of innate connection to nature, and that they often work in service of this Spellweaver Council. This leads me to consider 2 alternatives to the easy Wizard-Sorcerer route. Option 1, we would go Druid. We get a lot of spells that are nature-focused and can get some powerful effects. Admittedly, Wildfire Druid is actually a pretty great choice. A lot of the spells they get from their expanded spell list, plus their Wildfire Summon, actually mimic some Spellweaver cards quite perfectly. If you actually wanted to pull off a build that had abilities akin to the abilities on the cards, like 1-for-1, then I think this is the way to go. But it's not the way that we're going to go. We're going with option 2. We are servants of the Spellweaver Council, and our knowledge of magic stems from them. One might even call them a patron. We are choosing Warlock, and before you go and jump and start questioning my sanity, since the Warlock hardly gets any spells compared to other full casters, I would like to say that's actually the whole point. See, the thing that bugged me the most about all the other full casters is exactly that. They're full casters and have tons of longevity with the amount of resources that they have. The Spellweaver has the smallest hand size in all of Gloomhaven, with only 8 cards at a time. They have one big refresh card that helps them, but otherwise they are a firework, not a burning candle. The reason I want to go Warlock is to mimic this. This is what makes a Spellweaver unique. Any caster can take some elemental spells and call themselves an elementalist, but the Spellweaver does it with a very limited resource pool. Pact Magic is going to help us actually mimic that limited resource pool by giving us powerful high-level spell slots that refresh on a short rest, even though we only have a couple of them. Alright, so now we know we're going Warlock. But now the question is, what kind of Warlock? So what do we pick? Well, short of homebrewing our own or digging through the depths of Unearthed Arcana, and believe me, I've looked, we are actually going to end up going with Celestial, surprisingly. I would argue it's the most benevolent of all the patrons, and from what little we know about the Orchid Spellweaver Council, I think we could argue that there is some form of divinity sitting at the top. Mechanically, Celestial is going to give us access to healing, which the Spellweaver does have, but it's not going to force us to spend spell resources to use that healing. This is a nice benefit as it frees up our actions to do what the Spellweaver does best, AoE damage. A level 1 Celestial Warlock gets spellcasting with 2 cantrips, 2 spells, bonus cantrips, Light and Sacred Flame, and Healing Light, which is a pool of d6 equal to 1 plus Warlock level, and it's a bonus action to spend an amount of those d6 to heal a friendly target. The amount that you can spend is equal to your Charisma modifier. So lots of various rules and restrictions, but it's some extra healing, which is nice. We also get an expanded spell list, so we have access to Cure Wounds and Guiding Bolt. From this, I would recommend taking Eldritch Blast as our cantrip, and then one other Warlock cantrip. And for spells, we probably want Guiding Bolt and Armor of Agathis, or Agathes, depending on how you pronounce it. I always said Agathis, but I'm not too picky on my own pronunciations. Guiding Bolt is going to be our main AoE for a little while, which is kind of oxymoronic since Guiding Bolt only targets one creature. However, since we took Metamagic Adept, we can twin spell it a couple of times per day to really make it worth the spell slot. In fact, at level 1, we can actually twin spell it more times than we can cast it technically, because we only have one spell slot, so we have to wait for the short rest, so then we can twin spell it a second time and use our second Metamagic Adept sorcery point. Alright, we spent more than enough time on level 1, let's move on to level 2. At level 2, we are Warlock 2. We now gain our first 2 invocations, and we gain an additional spell and spell slot. For the spell, I would recommend Arms of Hadar, or Hadar again, however you pronounce it. It's the only actual AoE spell available to Warlocks early on, and admittedly it doesn't mimic any Spellweaver card exactly, but it does deal necrotic damage, and I would just argue that as a Spellweaver, we accidentally started with the elements of light and dark before any of the other elements. If you don't like Arms of Hadar, then Hellish Rebuke is a good runner-up. It's basically Retaliate, and if you play Spellweaver the way I did, you'll never use Retaliate, but it's there anyways. For invocations, we're going to take Agonizing Blast because it's busted. Even with the rules as intended, where you only add your Charisma modifier once per turn, instead of to every single Eldritch Blast, like the actual rules as written say, it's still pretty powerful. Then we're going to take another invocation of our choice. It doesn't really matter what we were picking up here, because we're going to replace it next level. At level 3, we are a Warlock 3, and therefore we're going to gain our Pact Boon. We also get an additional spell again, and our spell slots are now level 2. The Pact Boon that we're going to take is Pact of the Tome. I like Pact of the Tome here as it will let us mimic a wizard with a spellbook. I said that wizards and spellbooks aren't something that spellweavers typically have, but this will at least make us feel like that, as though we are an actual full caster with a whole bunch of access to magic, without actually completely diving into we need a spellbook to cast spells. The spellbook immediately will give us some extra cantrips, specifically 3 from any caster class. And we're also going to replace our second invocation with Book of Ancient Secrets. This will allow us to grab some rituals that we can store in the book as well. And if we find more ritual spells in our travels, then we can add those to the book too. Right now, with a bit of meta magic and the Book of Shadows, we're basically an amalgamation of 3 of the primary spellcasting classes: Wizard, Sorcerer, and Warlock, of course. I'd say that's pretty fitting for the Spellweaver, who's able to weave and create all sorts of different, admittedly elemental magics in Gloomhaven lore, but for us, just magic in general. If you're curious about what cantrips to take, I would recommend Guidance, since it's broken, Shocking Grasp, and Ray of Frost. You can pick whichever ones you want in reality, but just remember that the Spellweaver does like their cantrips. Looking at the spells now, since we have access to level 2 spell slots, the spell we should take is probably going to be Shatter. Though keep in mind we do have some spells from our expanded spell list, like Flaming Spear and Lesser Restoration. But Shatter is now our Pride and Joy AoE spell. With Transmuted Spell, we can change this damage type to another elemental damage type, which usually doesn't actually do anything for us since it's already thunder damage and that's not really resisted too much. But it's very thematic that we can use it to make either fire or ice, and hopefully if there's an enemy that is vulnerable to either of those, then this will actually come in handy. At level 4, we are going to bite the biggest bullet and jump into Sorcerer. I know I had made a big deal about the Spellweaver being a Warlock, and I do stand by that, but we need a bit more meta magic in AoE, and there's only one real way to get it. At Sorcerer 1, we have to make another decision about what is thematically appropriate, and yada 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 yada. Long story short, none of the subclasses are really a good elementalist. The one sorcerer subclass I'm going to go with is probably the least immersion breaking while still being mechanically somewhat beneficial, and that is Lunar Sorcery. Lunar Sorcery is going to get us a boost to our Sacred Flame cantrip. We can now target 2 creatures if they are within 5 feet of one another, which is basically add target, which is awesome. And we also gain an expanded spell list. We do have to choose what moon to mimic in order to determine the spells, but I would flavor this as being in tune with different forces of nature rather than different cycles of the moon. Also, we are now going to gain 4 more cantrips and 2 more spells. To avoid listing each and every spell/cantrip we should take, I'll make it simple. For cantrips, pick up elements you don't have. For spells, pick AoE. Burning Hands, Magic Missile technically, Thunder Wave, etc. Whatever you want. As a side note, if you aren't aware of how multi-classing spell slots work, especially with Warlock, there are rules for it in the PHB, and you can probably find them somewhere else online. For the most part, it really boils down to we have some spells that are going to come back on a long rest, which are our weaker sorcerer spell slots, and we have high-level Warlock spells that are going to come back on short rest still, since they are packed magic. And the nice thing is that we can use them interchangeably for any spell that we have access to, whether it's known through Sorcerer or known through Warlock. At level 5, we unlock the Font of Magic by continuing into Sorcerer 2. Font of Magic actually gives us access to sorcery points, though it doesn't give us access to meta magic just yet. This is probably a good time to mention as well how our spell slots are breaking down. So right now we have 3 first level spell slots, and 2 second level spell slots that refresh on a short rest since they're the packed magic. If you want to use your first level spell slots as actual spell slots, be my guest. I, however, would just be tempted to use them as fuel by breaking them into sorcery points and then using those sorcery points to fuel our meta magic options from Meta Magic Adept. We can just twin spell or transmute spell until the day we die and really make use of our spell slots with our packed magic feature. Also, we do get to pick a new spell. It has to be first level and from the sorcerer spell list, so pretty much, again, just pick any spell that feels right to you. At level 6, we're wrapping up our little jaunt in sorcerer with level 3 sorcerer. We get meta magic for real, it's not just the feat this time, and with that we're going to pick 2 other options that we didn't have previously. For this build, that's going to be Quicken Spell and Careful Spell. We have access to second level sorcerer spells now as well, and we get another spell, so it's time to pick another AoE one from sorcerer that can rival our Shatter. We also get an extra sorcery point, so don't forget that when looking at either performing some meta magic or recreating your sorcery spell slots. At level 7, we are going to jump back to Warlock in order to gain our ASI/feat. We can really do whatever we want here, but for me, I think it's about time we upped our charisma and made our spellcasting a bit more deadly. If you have another option you prefer, then feel free to change it up, but we're really behind in our scaling, so it's probably a good idea to just up our charisma. Also, we get a new cantrip and a new spell, so cantrip is pick your favorite as per usual, and for our spell, we're going to go back and grab Flaming Sphere. We would have picked this up a lot earlier if it wasn't for the fact that we really wanted Shatter at the time. At level 8, I would normally say let's continue with Warlock, but since we're already here and we realistically are only 1 level away from being back to scaling properly, we're going to jump back to Sorcerer and gain another ASI/feat. I'm immediately going to up our charisma again and cap it off so we don't have to worry about it at all. If you want, you can choose something else to do, but I really like just having our charisma be right on point with being 20 at level 8, just as the designers sort of intended. Checking in with our spell slots again, we're now 4 first level slots and 5 second level slots. That's really cool. I've never really had a character that has 5 second level slots. That is, however, going to change soon, so don't get too used to it. Since we're also going to get some sorcery spells, I would recommend picking up either another second level AoE or invisibility. The Spellweaver doesn't really have access to a lot of invisibility, but they do have some, so it's going to be worth the investment no matter how we get there. At 9th level, we're going to jump back over into Warlock, and I'm going to say flat out we are now sticking with Warlock for the rest of the build. I will go through the levels, since the invocations we want are going to be a little specific, but as far as abilities/features, we're just grabbing whatever the Warlock/Celestial Pact is going to give us. Speaking of invocations, we do get a 3rd one. Any of them can work well, and none of them are overly thematic, sadly to say. If we wanted to mimic a pull effect, we could actually take Grasp of Hadar. It upgrades Eldritch Blast so that we can do a 10-foot pull against the creature we hit with Eldritch Blast once per turn. And if we wanted a push effect, we could take Repelling Blast, which essentially does the same thing, but pushing 10 feet instead of pulling 10 feet. We can also take Far Scribe, which is the next tome-focused one. It allows us to essentially cast Sending for free with anyone who has their name written in the book, which is a very powerful effect, but nothing really like Gloomhaven offers us. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take it though, it just means that it might not be the top option on our list. Another option would be to take Mire the Mind. It allows us to cast Slow once using a Warlock spell slot. It's a powerful AoE debuff, so I'm actually inclined to take that as it gives us another AoE option that isn't necessarily just damage. The only drawback that it does use one of our precious Warlock spell slots, which at this point we may want to use to cast other spells with. Pick whatever invocation you feel is appropriate, and for this build I'm just going to stick with the AoE and not worry too much about push or pull or the sending through the book either, since that's not too much of what we're really theory crafting for at this point. So we're going to take Mire the Mind, as we know a powerful AoE debuff is going to be something that we will love to have. For the spells we now have access to, we get Daylight and Revivify from Celestial Warlock, so we could take either of those. But we could also take Counterspell from being a 5th level Warlock. Any of these spells are going to be nice additions to a regular character in a regular D&D party. But this isn't a regular D&D character. We're going for an actual sort of themed build here. And because of that, it's time to pick up a summon spell. We're going to want to mimic our Spellweaver summons, and really the summon spells from D&D are the best way to do that. We'll get other spells eventually, don't worry. But for now, getting a summon is the next step in our theme recreation. We only have a few options for summon spells: Summon Fae, Undead, or Shadow Spawn. Unfortunately, the only one of those that gives us a ranged summon is Summon Undead, which doesn't perfectly fit thematically, but that's where flavoring comes into play. Long story short, we're going to take Summon Undead and use it to summon a skeletal ally, but we're going to flavor it to be more like our mystic ally. This took us a long time to get to this card, given that it's a really early on card, and I know I said I wasn't really mimicking cards exactly, but summons are a bit of a loophole since each summon kind of does one thing specifically, and I want to try and recreate that one thing that they do, at least relatively well. Either way, we're glad we have the summon now. At level 10, we're going to end up Warlock 6. This level, we're going to gain Radiant Soul. It gives us resistance to radiant damage and a buff to one of our fire/radiant damage spell rolls. Adds charisma bonus, but only to one of those rolls. We don't have as much AoE fire damage as I would like, but Flaming Spear, we're going to make it work. We don't have as much AoE fire damage as I would like, but with Flaming Spear, we're going to make it work. Since we have multiple concentration spells that we could use, I would judge the situation and pick what we need most in the moment. Pick whichever option is going to work best for you when you need it. And we are also going to gain another Warlock spell, so we're probably going to want to go back and pick up Revivify or Counterspell or even Dispel Magic, just to make sure that we actually can do some stuff that a good D&D spellcaster can do. At level 11, we are Warlock 7, and we gain access to 4th level spell slots and an extra spell to go with it. We also gain a 4th invocation. The 4th invocation can be whatever we like. There will be some that we're going to want specifically to choose, but that's not for another few levels. For our 4th level spell, we probably want it to either be Wall of Fire or Sickening Radiance, since they are some very strong AoE effects. However, both those options are again concentration, and we just talked last level about how many other concentration spells we have to choose from. If you'd rather not pick another concentration spell, then Raulothim's, again, I don't know pronunciation all that well, but either way, the Psychic Lance is a great spell that could also be twinned for some really devastating effects. At level 12, we're a level 8 Warlock, and that means another ASI/feat for us. And since our charisma is already capped, we can pretty much take anything we want and be happy with it. I, however, am going to take Eldritch Adept in order to gain access to another Eldritch Invocation. And the invocation that we take at this level, again, doesn't really matter, but we're going to be changing it next level no matter what we take. Still nice to have, though. At level 13, we are Warlock 9, and we're going to gain quite a bit. First, our spell slots are 5th level, and we gain a 5th level spell. We're going to take Flame Strike without question here. This is our Inferno card. Next, we're also going to gain another invocation. With this new invocation, and the one from our feat last level, we are going to go back and take Otherworldly Leap and Minions of Chaos. Otherworldly Leap allows us to cast Jump on ourselves at will. Jump, the spell, will be our Jump Gloomhaven effect. It's pretty straightforward there. Minions of Chaos, however, allows us to cast Conjure Elemental once per day using a Warlock spell slot. This is our Flame Avatar/Elemental summon. It's not a one-to-one recreation, but it's close enough and we'll have to do. We could also conjure other elementals as well, but since the Spellweaver gets a fair number of flame summons, or flame-based summons, I think the flame one should be the most reliable one, though you don't have to always cast that elemental specifically, if you don't want to. At level 14, we're a Warlock 10, and here we gain Celestial Resistance. It gives us temporary hit points whenever we finish a long rest equal to our Charisma plus Warlock level, well, Charisma modifier. And our allies also gain temporary hit points equal to our Charisma modifier plus half our Warlock level. In Gloomhaven terms, this is extra shield. The Spellweaver is capable of buffing allies with shield surprisingly enough, so we'll actually take this and like it. We also gain another cantrip, and you can pick your favorite again. At level 15, we're a level 11 Warlock, and this is also going to gain us another big power boost. We have a third Warlock spell slot. We also get an additional Warlock spell, which has to be a 5th level spell, and I'll explain why in a second. And for the spell, I would suggest taking Synaptic Static. It is a large AoE damage spell that also has a significant debuff, which is -1d6 on attacks, checks, and saves to any enemy that fails their saving throw against the spell. However, if you like other spells more, then feel free to pick one of those instead. Finally, we also gain our first Mystic Arcanum. Mystic Arcanum is a special Warlock ability that allows us to cast high-level spells without expending a spell slot. The trade-off is that we can only cast this spell we learned from Mystic Arcanum, and we don't get it back on a short rest. So our Mystic Arcanum ability for now is probably going to be Circle of Death. It's yet again a powerful AoE spell. If you feel that we already have enough AoE and would like to pick something different, then you're probably wrong. But in all seriousness, you can go ahead and take a look at anything else that you want. Just remember that as the Spellweaver, AoE damage is kind of our bread and butter, but anything's really open to whatever we would like to do. There are a lot of good spells here that can actually be worthwhile, so definitely take a look at all of them. Mystic Arcanum is also the reason why we had to choose a 5th level spell, even though we were a level 11 Warlock. Normally we would gain access to 6th level spells, but because of the way Pact Magic and Mystic Arcanum work within the class, we don't actually get to do that too well, so we'll just be happy with a 3rd, 5th level spell. Level 16, we're level 12 Warlock, and we're going to gain another ASI/feat, as well as another invocation. To be honest, I'm not quite sure what to take here, and really as long as we keep in our theme, there's nothing that we could really take that's going to make us go wrong. I personally would recommend either buffing our health with +2 con from an ASI, or buffing our AC with +2 dex, or taking Elemental Adept to give our fire spells another small damage buff. For invocations, there also aren't too many necessary invocations for us anymore. Even though they are a little off theme, I would go back and start taking the tome invocations. There's either Far Scribe, which is the sending one if we didn't grab it yet, or Gift of the Protectors, which says that anyone with their name in the book can drop to 1 HP instead of 0 the first time they would be downed. Again, neither of these are very Gloomhaven-esque, but we have kind of already gotten all the Gloomhaven theme we're ever going to get, so in short, go nuts and have fun. Level 17 is level 13 Warlock, and that's also our next Mystic Arcanum, as well as another spell. Pick your favorite spell, since it still has to be 5th level or lower, but for a Mystic Arcanum, I would recommend Crown of Stars. It's not a concentration spell, and it only uses our bonus action, and then it's actually going to give us some more bonus action attacks that we're going to be able to use over time. Currently, our bonus action is probably well spoken for with either healing, Flaming Sphere if that's up, Quicken Spell if we're using that to then cantrip with our action, or some other effect that I'm forgetting that we have. If you don't want the extra bonus action economy, then any other 7th level Warlock spell works just fine. However, Crown of Stars is really tempting here, as we could then start getting AoE spells off for damage and output a bonus action single target damage spell. Well, not even a full spell, just an attack as well. Level 18 is level 14 for us multi-classing peeps, and we're going to gain our final Celestial Warlock ability, that is Searing Vengeance. It's essentially a come back from death plus deal some damage plus debuff any nearby enemies ability. There's not a shred of Gloomhaven in this ability. Or is there? I would just call this our actual Reviving Ether. Obviously until now, Reviving Ether was the fact that we got spells back on a short rest as opposed to a long rest from Pact Magic, but a whole Rise from the Dead Phoenix sort of esque ability also really works well too. Think of it however you want. Either way, we're glad to have this ability, as it's just going to keep us in the fight even when our DM, or the enemies at least, think we're down. Level 19 is level 15 for Warlock, and that's another spell, another invocation, and another Mystic Arcanum, this time at level 8. The only choice that kind of matters here is Mystic Arcanum, so for everything else, pick your favorite. But for us, our Mystic Arcanum we're going to want is Maddening Darkness. This is a spell that kind of feels like our Black Hole card. There's no pull effect, but it is a big AoE spell that deals an equal amount of damage as a fireball. The bonus here for us is that it's concentration and has double the radius of fireball, so that it can really add up to a lot of damage over time. However, if you would rather avoid another concentration spell, then you can choose any of the other level 8 Warlock spells. They're all pretty good for what we would want to do. Finally, at level 20, we're a level 16 Warlock, still level 4 Sorcerer, and we're going to gain another ASI/feat. Here I would go back and buff our health or AC if we didn't already, and if we did, I would probably just buff it again. There's not too much more to say. I do want to make one last note on the build. If you're actually going to play this, and you knew that you're going to make it all the way up here to level 20, I would personally go back and skip the 4th level of Sorcerer. At level 17, we gain our 4th and final Warlock spell slot, and that would give us access to a 9th level Mystic Arcanum. While it was very nice having capped Charisma very early on, these high-level benefits of like a 9th level spell probably outweigh that one extra level of Sorcerer, just given it how powerful 9th level spells can really be. Alright, time to summarize our build. We certainly do the weaving of the spells. We have 4 sorcery points that we can spend on spell slots or meta magic, and 2 sorcery points that can only be spent on meta magic. I would personally just try to use all of these on meta magic probably, and then use the sorcerer spell slots that we do have to fuel more sorcery points for more meta magic. If we're doing that, then we really only ever have 3 or fewer spell slots. However, those spell slots are always high level, which can be very beneficial for us, and they come back on a short rest, which means we should always have them ready to go, assuming we always get a short rest in between combat encounters. If you're dungeon crawling, that might not be the case, but what can we do? We also have a vast amount of elemental damage when it comes to cantrips. Even though Eldritch Blast is going to be our most tempting cantrip to use, I would still keep a few others on deck as backups. It's always fun to just blast out an elemental damage cantrip every now and then and not just be a one-trick pony with Eldritch Blast. You also never know when you'll need to use a saving throw spell instead of an attack to get around cover, unless you ended up taking the spell sniper feat at some point, in which case, ignore that. Our actual spells are pretty much all concentration, or AoE, or both. And while that isn't necessarily ideal, it is nice since that means they'll certainly be powerful. And with meta magic to bolster them, they may even be more powerful than we initially realized when we take those spells. Above all else, I think we have almost perfectly captured the Spellweaver's small stamina pool, or hand size. The Warlock is the ideal class for mimicking the small hand size, but admittedly it does not have the proper AoE effects that we would like. We would really want a few more fire, and ice, and other elemental spells, similar like Fireball or Cone of Cold, but we'll take what we could get since we really did want Warlock to be able to mimic that refresh feeling, and Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule, such as the Fiend Warlock or just not going Warlock to begin with, which are all valid options that we could have taken. However, I think we managed to do the best we could with what we had. And we still got a bunch of various Gloomhaven effects just through the Warlock invocations, like Jump, Summon, and Push and Pull if we did end up taking those instead of what I had sort of walked us through with taking. Overall, it may not be perfect, but I think it's as close as we're going to get to making the Spellweaver in D&D. Plus, it leaves us some room to use other spellcasting classes for other Gloomhaven classes. Hint, hint. Let me know what you thought of the build or what you would change to get closer to the theme of the actual Gloomhaven character class. And thank you for joining me on this journey. Hope to see you in the next one.